The provision prefaced with such words is a subordinate constitutional provision. It also cannot mean once the mean implies the implementation rather than grant of power. Number one. It doesn't imply, it implies limitation rather than grant of power. If rule-making power is made subject to legislation, sir, then the rule-making power of Supreme Court will become functus officio. Constitutional grant of rule-making power is construed as a continuing power, sir. So there cannot be any limitations on that, or constitutional power given that. It is not an enabling provision. Subject cannot mean subject to legislation, sir. If subject law is interpreted as Supreme Court's rule-making power are subject to, then that would be a grave violation of independence and separation of powers doctrine, sir. Subject law means substantive law. Subject to law means substantive law as distinguished from pleading and practice. Substantive law includes much more than legislation. It includes common law. Subject to law means rule-making power as to practice law must not invade the field of substantive law. So there has to be something existing. It cannot invade the field of substantive law. But it does not give them the power to legislate, sir. And, sir, with your Lordship's kind permission, I have prepared
what you're saying is that the Parliament cannot make rules nor legislate regarding the rules. And all the Parliament can do is subsequent legislation नहीं हो सकती. ये जो existing law था उसके दायरे कार में रहते हुए और कानून
आप rules नहीं बना सकते.
दायरे कार में रहते हुए power in any event vests in the Supreme Court.
Supreme Court exclusively, sir, because the word used is not just rule making; it is regulate. That we can by rule regulate the practice.
Now I'll read the provision.
Yes, my lord.
Let's reframe the whole provision.
My lord.
It says, now let's read it like this.
My lord.
The Supreme Court may make rules regulating the practice and procedure of the court.
Yes, my lord.
So are you saying that Supreme Court had to be advised about the Constitution, had to be advised about the law, because it would make rules which will be completely in violation of the Constitution and the law? So it would have been much simpler drafting to start it with the Supreme Court may make rules regulating the practice and procedure of the court. Your contention is that a high body, as the constitutional body, as the Supreme Court, had to be reminded that there is a constitution in existence. Don't violate it. That's a very strange proposition.
No.
You are putting redundancy to the words subject to the constitution and law, because what you are saying can equally be said by deleting these words.
My lord, with the utmost respect, my lord.
जवाब नहीं, let's hear the council. जी, please सुन लेते हैं council को.
I'm also reading it the same way. The Supreme Court may make rules and regulating the practice and procedure of the court,
My lord.
subject to the Constitution and the law.
My lord,
Which means Supreme Court can make rules,
yes,
whatever rules it wants to make.
जी.
But it can't go beyond
the Constitution or any law which already exists.
So there is
वो मेरा सवाल अपनी जगह ठहरा. हुजूर आप जवाब तो दे दीजिए.
My lord, with utmost respect, I'm not reading it
utmost respect को छोड़िए, सिर्फ जवाब दे दीजिए.
अच्छा सर, आपके साथ
जरा वक्त की कमी है.
जी, I know, my lord. I'm just saying that subject to law, subject means some kind of restriction.
मैं आपसे कुछ और मैंने आपसे आप देखें जो मैंने सवाल है उसका तो आप जवाब
मैं आ तो जाऊं
नहीं. आप आएंगे तो अगर दिन निकल जाएगा. मैंने कहा अगर ये हम लफ्ज काट दें सब्जेक्ट टू द कॉन्स्टिट्यूशन एंड लॉ, फर्क क्या पड़ेगा फिर? जी, ये इसका सवाल का जवाब दे दीजिए.
फर्क नहीं पड़ेगा, लेकिन पॉइंट इज
नहीं पड़ेगा ना.
नहीं, लेकिन
थैंक यू.
इशू
चलिए नेक्स्ट पॉइंट.
नहीं सर, पहले अभी सुन तो ले, मैं कंप्लीट तो कर लूं सर आपकी इजाजत से. अगर फिर भी कोई लॉ आप रूल नहीं बना सकेंगे which violates any provision of the Constitution.
Is this something to be taught to the Supreme Court?
No, sir. But I'm humbly submitting subject to law does not mean the Parliament can legislate. That is my humble submission. Subject to, क्योंकि जहां Parliament जहां Constitution power देता है Parliament को बना दिया, specific words are used.
चलें खैर,
जी.
पता नहीं आप redundancy is
I'm not assuming it is.
1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 words of the Constitution we can delete as rendered meaningless.
So
I'm reading it like that if I accept your contention.
Subject to only means, my humble submission is that subject to only means that there is some kind of a restricting, because the constitutional power, which is a continuing power, is being given to the Supreme Court.
Noted. Next point.
The point is that the words used in the G if Constitution is giving power to to make any law, it specifically used certain words in the Constitution. If my Lord kindly sees 154(5), Article 154(5). Next page. My Lord, until Majlis Shura Parliament makes provision by law in this behalf, the Council may make its rules of procedure. These are the words. Then Article 6.3, my Lord, if my Lord kindly sees Article 6.3. Article
6.3 or 63?
6.3. Article 6, subclause 3. I see another one. Yeah. 6, Article 6. Majlis shall by law. Article 6, my Lord. Yeah.
जी पढ़ लिया
जी Majlis shall by law provide punishment of persons found guilty of high treason. Then my Lord will kindly see 151(2). Freedom of trade. And my Lord also reads 150, subject to clause 2, trade, commerce, intercourse throughout Pakistan shall be. Majlis Shura may by law impose such restrictions. May by law. Again, sir. Then my Lord,
what is the point you're making?
I'm making,
you're just citing different provisions.
My Lord, if the word in the 191 was the Parliament can make law, these kind of expressions as provided in the Constitution would have been used, my Lord. My humble submission is that when the Constitution is giving the legislature a power to enact a law, then specifically words are used in the power.
Mr. Zubairi, there's another question.
My Lord.
Once the rule-making power has been exercised,
my Lord,
by the Supreme Court in terms of the Constitution, because the power vests in the Supreme Court, can subsequent legislation displace, as this Act purports to do so, can subsequent legislation displace the rules that have lawfully been and constitutionally been framed by the Supreme Court?
No, my Lord, that's my humble submission. They cannot, for the simple reason, because then it will become ad nauseum. For example, can now the Supreme Court, which can make law regulating its practice procedure, make a law overriding the Parliament's making of the law? Then the Parliament will do it. Then where will we stop? So my humble submission is that could not have been the intention of the framers of the Constitution, that to give power to Parliament, because there are separation of power doctrines there. Once, because Honorable Supreme Court has made the rules regarding regulating the practice procedure, the Parliament does not. But that practice and procedure, the rules, cannot be in violation of any constitutional provision, any law which existed, sir.
So the core question is, where does the Constitution confer, in which institution confer the power to make rules?
Ji.
Whether it is the Parliament or is it the Supreme Court?
Ji.
If it is the Supreme Court, the only restriction is that the Supreme Court can do so within the framework of the Constitution and the existing law.
My Lord.
And that's it.
Yes,
the Parliament cannot, because the power does not rest in the Constitution in the Parliament in terms of Article 199.
191, my Lord.
Next point.
My humble submission on this score is that's the reason I was saying.
I would really want to hear you, Mr. Zubairi.
Sir, my Lord is asking a question.
नहीं वो आप बात तो करें फिर सवाल उठेगा यकीनन.
पूछ रहे हो इसी बात से सवाल उठाए सर. जी.
Now, if I may ask you, these words subject to the Constitution, if these words were all, and one were to point out, well, sir, this proposed rule X is contrary to the Constitution, the answer would presumably be, the Supreme Court would say, well, okay, yes, you are right, so we can't make rule X, right? So in that sense, saying subject to the Constitution is always redundant.
Yes.
Because it's always going to be there.
Yeah.
To me, but this is the question, that perhaps there is a more subtle point here. The Constitution, of course, can also be amended. Yes?
Yes,
under
madam.
Article. But by and large, the Constitution is regarded at any given time to be fixed, right? This is it. Underneath it, whatever happens by the judiciary, by the executive, by the legislature. So maybe the point in saying subject to the Constitution is not to make the obvious thinking about this since the case started. Why say subject to the Constitution? Because everything is always subject to the Constitution.
Mr. Zaveri, I just want to say one thing. The day we hear this case, the weeks we hear this case, our institution exceeds our disposal. The day we don't, our disposal exceeds our execution. If you think this is a never-ending hearing, this is the last day of the hearing.
My Lord.
Please remember that. You can argue till 11:30, and each one of us may have their views. Let them be expressed in judgments. I want to hear counsel.
Sir, when a
I mean, if you,
my Lord,
please continue. We will restrain ourselves. You just continue your argument so we can be enlightened what you want to tell us, and we can record it, and we can either agree with you or disagree with you in our judgments.
Sir, my Lord,
आप आगे बढ़िए, please. Next point. Please go on to the next. Please go on to the next point.
So my point is that, again, my Lord, that when the law is being given to the Parliament, so hence subject to law, and for that I want to take you, my Lord, I have placed certain case law with your Lordship, if my Lord has that.
दे दिए या देंगे?
ये रखे हुए सर,
पहले से नहीं दिए?
सर दिए हैं, बहुत पहले से दिए हैं, रखे हुए हैं
आज
नहीं सर, मतलब उन्होंने कहा जब आप आर्ग्यू करेंगे उस वक्त दीजिएगा, मैं तो कब हर रोज लेके आ रहा हूँ सर.
सॉरी, दिस इज मोस्ट अनफेयर. हमने कहा था लोगों को फाइल कर दें.
ये केस हम
हाँ ठीक है, यू आर राइट, वी आर रॉन्ग.
नहीं सर,
वी हैव टोल्ड एवरीबॉडी टू फाइल. हाँ भी कागज के टुकड़े आ रहे हैं बीच में से, और ये कोई आसान चीज है पढ़ना.
इस लॉ है सर, इसमें
तो पहले नहीं कर सकते थे फाइल. इन दुनिया में ऐसे होता है या सिर्फ निजाम अदल पाकिस्तान में ऐसा चलेगा? आगे दुनिया की हम तारीख में बताते हैं. ये जरा प्लीज ठहर जाइए ना कि अमेरिका में क्या होता है, विलायत में होता है. आप ये करें अमेरिका विलायत में जाकर के, फिर क्या होगा आपके साथ? वहां तो आप सारे वेस्टर्न ट्रेडिशंस बताते हैं, इस्लामिक ट्रेडिशंस तो बताते नहीं है. अगर कागज के मामले में ठीक है भाई, मेरी मर्जी जब मैं करूं. सच अ सीनियर काउंसिल.
माय लॉर्ड, मे आई टेक पेज 144 ऑफ दिस इज अ केस.
क्या आप हमें प्रोपोजिशन बताएं? पहले प्रोपोजिशन बताया जाता है.
हाउ अ सब्जेक्ट टू लॉ हैज टू बी इंटरप्रेटेड, दैट इज माय.
ठीक है, बता दें कि इसका नंबर.
केस इज पेज 144 ऑफ दिस बुकलेट सर. Winberry versus Salisbury. It's a case from the American jurisdiction, and they have interpreted this word, what is the meaning of, and their constitution also provided this thing.
And their constitution also permits filing of documents in courts. चलिए खैर, 144.
Sir, this is just a
ये
case.
सुप्रीम कोर्ट का है, ये सुप्रीम कोर्ट का
नहीं सर, it is Supreme Court of New Jersey, sir.
अच्छा ठीक है
जी. My Lord, page 145. If my Lord kindly sees the sixth line from the top.
देखिए वो जरा मुनासिब नहीं लगता है. सुप्रीम कोर्ट ऑफ पाकिस्तान फुल बेंच में, सुप्रीम कोर्ट ऑफ न्यू जर्सी का जरा ठहर तो जाइए ना. हमें हमारा लेवल इतना लो तो ना कर दें. सुप्रीम कोर्ट ऑफ अमेरिका तो बताइए, आप सुप्रीम कोर्ट ऑफ न्यू जर्सी को हम फॉलो करेंगे.
सर मैं सिर्फ बता रहा हूँ कि
हाँ बता दें, जबानी बता दें. आपकी बात में ज्यादा वजन है बल्कि सुप्रीम कोर्ट ऑफ न्यू जर्सी में.
उनके कॉन्स्टिट्यूशन में इस तरह के लफ्ज नहीं है, लेकिन उनके जो स्टेट्स हैं उनके कॉन्स्टिट्यूशन में इस तरह के लफ्ज हैं. Kindly see, the Supreme Court shall make rules governing the administration of all courts, state, and subject to law the practice and procedure of all such courts. This is the law which they interpreted. And my Lord, it says, para 2 on page 145.
The phrase subject to law.
The phrase subject to law is not only ambiguous but elliptical. No word
what is elliptical mean?
Sir, मतलब कि it is confusing. जी.
You reading a word? You tell us the meaning of the word.
Continuous, sir. Continuous. No word in the law has more varied meaning than the term law itself. Nor is the phrase subject to crystal clear, for the phrase implies a limitation rather than a grant of power. It is argued by plain subject law means subject to statute or legislation.
It is argued. ये judgment भी नहीं है.
जी आ रहा हूँ sir. If subject, अब नीचे last paragraph, sir. If the subject were to interpret it to mean subject to legislation, it would necessarily follow that once the legislature has passed a statute in conflict with the rule of court, the rule-making power of Supreme Court will become functus officio. For it would intolerable to hold, as has been suggested to us, that after the legislature has passed an act modifying a rule of court, the Supreme Court might in turn adopt a new role overriding the statute, and so on ad nauseum. And yet, if subject to law means subject to legislation, any other construction of rule-making power would be in conflict with fundamental rule of constitutional constraint that unless the context clearly requires otherwise, a constitutional grant of authority is to be interpreted as a continuing power. My Lord, then the last three lines, page 146. All these
पेज 147 से पढ़ लीजिए।
जी हाँ, उसमें आ रहा
पेज 147 लास्ट 2 लाइन से पढ़
जी
लीजिए।
जी बहुत बेहतर।
वो वही आ रहा है, नीचे आ रहा है
जी, इसमें फिर सब पेज 146 पे
147 की लास्ट 2 लाइन से पढ़ लीजिए ना, वो आपको थोड़ा सा उसमें जवाब मिल रहा है।
जवाब आ रहा है कि मैं कुछ आपको पॉइंट आउट करना चाह रहा हूँ कि पेज 146 के लास्ट 3 लाइंस देख लीजिए। मैं सिर्फ वो जो पॉइंट्स हैं उसको आपको दिखा दूंगा सर। It is inconceivable that the people granted continuing power to the courts in all these respects or withheld it with reference to rule making, sir. Then, my Lord, page 147.
लास्ट 2 लाइन।
Okay. If the Raj may amend the rules or it may decide the extent to which the law division charge shall excise the powers functions of other division. It may control the degree to which legal and equitable relief may be granted in any cause. We think it may be safely and that no such thoughts are ever in the mind of the member of Constitutional Convention or any citizen who voted for the Constitution. Yet, if subject to law means subject to legislation, such results might inevitably follow. The courts in some of their essential judicial office, instead of being one of 3 coordinate branches of state government, would have been rendered subservient to the legislature in a fashion never contemplated by any. What then is the meaning of subject to law? The only interpretation of subject law that will not defeat the objective of the people to establish an integrated judicial system which is independent and which will at the same time give rational significance to phrase is to construe it as equivalent of substantive law as distinguished from pleading and practice. The distinction between substantive, which defines our rights and duties, and the law of pleading and practice, or through which such rights and duties are enforced in courts, is a fundamental one that is part of daily thinking of judges. Substantive law includes much more than legislation. It comprehends also the rights and duties which have come down to us through the common law. The phrase subject to law in Article 6 of the Constitution thus serves as a continuous reminder that rule-making power as to practice must not invade the field of substantive law as such. While the court necessarily make new substantive law through the decision of specific case in commonwealth, they are not to make substantive law wholesale through the exercise of rule-making power. That is the concept. So, subject to law does not give them a power to legislate. It is not subject to legislation. Where it is made subject to legislation, then the Constitution uses the words. Make such as pointed out. ये कई articles हैं of the Constitution, मैंने 154, 150, then 240, 241 and 242 के अंदर भी यही लफ्ज हुआ है, make by law.
The law which is in dispute has been made pursuant to Article 175(2).
Yes,
this is the power of the judicature.
Sir,
so, in the law itself, pursuant to Article 175(2), read with Article 191. We are making much time on 191. What about Article 175(2)? Because no court has jurisdiction unless conferred by the Constitution or the law.
Yes, but 175(2) cannot be read in isolation. That is the judgment of the court.
It is dedicated to the judicator.
Sir, may I
so power of the court are conferred under Article 175.
Read with Article 142.
Read with, that is the law that have made under pursuant to 191. Read with 191. Yes, but the law has been made pursuant to Article 175. उसको पढ़े ना 2 में आपके वो jurisdiction किसी कोर्ट का jurisdiction जो है that is related and based on the premise of Article 175(2).
My Lord, then provincial law भी आपके लिए province बना सकते हैं.
The courts 175 there shall be a Supreme Court of Pakistan, a High Court for each province.
And such a court as may be established by law. In no court,
Article 2,
no court shall have any jurisdiction save as is or may be conferred on it by constitution by or under any law. That is synonymous. But humble submission is that this honorable court has interpreted when it deals with the Supreme Court, it has to be read with 2 further articles, Article 142A and Entry 55. May I take your lordship to Article 142A?
Yes.
And that is the judgment of this honorable court, sir.
So this article, I don't understand.
It's not a standalone article, sir.
It is?
Does, no, with humble submission. That
No, you are now reading words into the Constitution.
I'm reading-
No, where does it say it's not a standalone article?
is because the judgment of the
So you
Supreme
can
Court says
imply it, but it doesn't say so.
Sir, I'm not saying anything on my own. I based my arguments on case law and I cite a case law on that of this honorable court what they have said.
I think the whole object of a full court hearing counsel is being missed. If all we are going to do is keep referring to case law, we are sitting, the full court is sitting. I don't even think you understand the gravity of it. To understand, to learn from counsel.
Yes.
Refer to this judgment, refer to that judgment. By the plain words of the Constitution, you don't want to read. Then you want to read New Jersey Supreme Court. Let's read the plain words of the Constitution.
But
Let's hear counsel formulate submissions on that.
Then
by all means, if there is some ambiguity, we can
my
go
humble
to
submission,
precedent.
My humble submission
You see,
is that
the main rule for constitutional interpretation is that the entire Constitution has to be
read as a
whole in a context. You cannot pick up one article and just read it in isolation because there are other articles which either may restrict or enhance that power
Yes.
which exists in
and
one
how that power is to be
particular-
exercised. Now, what is the law they are talking about in Article 71, 75 2? No.